Rechlin airfield, north of Berlin, the summer of 1940. On the grass sits a fighter that, only weeks earlier, had been defending British skies. It is a captured Hawker Hurricane, repaired, repainted with German markings, and now waiting to be flown by the people it was built to fight. The German Air Force has brought it here for one reason. They want to take it apart in the air and prove, with hard numbers, that it is no match for their own fighter. And in large part, the numbers will say exactly that, but not all of them. Because buried in the report that comes out of these trials is an admission that does not fit the story the Luftwaffe wanted to tell. The aircraft they had been taught to dismiss could do one thing better than the pride of the German fighter arm, and their own pilots found it, of all things, a pleasure to fly. So here is the question this whole investigation turns on. If the Hurricane was as second-rate as the Luftwaffe insisted, why Germany's own test establishment came away from it grudgingly impressed? And why did the unglamorous fighter they dismissed on paper go on to destroy more of their aircraft than anything else in the sky over Britain? This is the story of how the most underrated fighter of the Battle of Britain was judged in secret by the very enemy it was built to defeat. It is the story of a verdict the Luftwaffe did not want to hear. And to understand why that verdict mattered so much, we have to go back to a drawing board in the early 1930s and to a designer who built a war winner out of materials the rest of the world was already calling old-fashioned. The man at the centre of it was Sydney Camm, the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft. Camm was not a romantic. He was a perfectionist with a sharp tongue and a fixation on getting things to actually work. When he set out to design a monoplane fighter, he made a choice that would later look either backward or brilliant, depending on who you asked. He built the new fighter using the methods Hawker already trusted. The fuselage was a frame of high tensile steel tube, covered with wooden formers and stretched fabric. The earliest wings were fabric too, before metal ones replaced them. This was not the gleaming all-metal future that Supermarine was chasing with the Spitfire. It was a bridge between the biplane age and the modern one, a monoplane with a fabric skin. The prototype first flew on the 6th of November 1935 from Brooklands, with the Hawker test pilot George Bullman at the controls. The first production Hurricane flew in October 1937. By December that year, it was entering service with No. 111 Squadron at Royal Air Force Northolt. It was the Royal Air Force's first monoplane fighter, and the first British fighter able to exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. What looked like a weakness turned out to be a quiet strength. A cannon shell could punch straight through the fabric and wood of the rear fuselage without finding anything solid enough to detonate against. Damage that would cripple a stressed metal aircraft could be patched at the airfield with dope and linen by ground crew who needed no special equipment. A Hurricane took far fewer working hours to build than a Spitfire, and a damaged one returned to the fight faster. It had a wide, sturdy undercarriage that forgave clumsy landings on rough grass fields. The German Messerschmitt, with its narrow undercarriage, was notorious for tipping over on the ground. None of this made the Hurricane glamorous. It was the plain one, the dependable one, and history has a habit of forgetting the dependable one. Then came the summer of 1940, and that plain fighter was thrown into the most important air battle in British history. Here the numbers tell a story most people get wrong. When the Battle of Britain began, Fighter Command had far more Hurricanes than Spitfires. Of the fighter squadrons committed, 32 flew Hurricanes and 19 flew Spitfires. Where the controllers could manage it, they used the two fighters differently. The faster, higher climbing Spitfires were sent to tangle with the German fighter screen. The steadier Hurricanes were aimed at the bombers, the aircraft that actually carried the threat to British cities and factories. That division of labour had a consequence. Because there were more Hurricanes, and because they were pointed at the bombers, the Hurricane did the bulk of the damage. By the most commonly cited Fighter Command figures, Hurricanes were credited with around 656 enemy aircraft destroyed, roughly 55% of the total. Some accounts from the Royal Air Force Museum put the Hurricane's share as high as 60% of all Luftwaffe losses. Whichever figure you trust, the conclusion is the same. The single most destructive British weapon in the Battle of Britain was not the Spitfire that everyone remembers. It was the Hurricane that almost nobody photographs. And that brings us back to Rechlin, and to the captured Hurricane, and to the verdict. The Battle of France in the spring of 1940 had handed the Germans a gift. 10 Hurricane squadrons had fought across France and then pulled back to Britain, and in the chaos of the retreat, intact and repairable Hurricanes were left behind on overrun airfields. The Luftwaffe now had flyable British fighters to study. They took them to Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the German Air Force's central test establishment, the place where every aircraft Germany flew was measured and judged. In August 1940, the results were written up in an official report. Its title described a comparison flight between the German fighters and the captured enemy machines, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and a French-built Curtiss. This is not legend. It is a real document signed by a staff officer named Kohler, and what it records is more interesting than either side's propaganda. On raw performance, the report was blunt. The Messerschmitt was faster than all of them and climbed better at every altitude. The Hurricane was the slowest of the captured trio, trailing the German fighter by a wide margin in level speed. The German testers noted that the British fighters still carried two pitch propellers that held their performance back, a fault the Royal Air Force was, in fact, racing to fix that very month. So far so reassuring for Berlin. But then came the admission. The report stated plainly that before entering a turning fight, German pilots had to keep one thing in mind. All three foreign aircraft had noticeably smaller turning circles and turning times than the Messerschmitt. In other words, in a tight turning contest, the British fighters could outturn the German one. The advice that followed was clear. Do not get dragged into a turning duel. Use your speed and your climb. Fight on your own terms. There was one more weakness the Germans noted, and it was a real one. When a Hurricane or Spitfire pilot shoved the stick forward into a sudden dive, the engine would cough and lose power for a moment. This was because the Rolls-Royce Merlin used a float carburettor that starved of fuel under negative gravity. The German Daimler-Benz engine used fuel injection and suffered no such hesitation. A German pilot being chased could simply bunt into a dive, and his engine would keep pulling cleanly while his pursuers stumbled. British pilots learned to half-roll before diving to work around it. The fault was only properly cured the following year, helped by an engineer named Beatrice Schilling, who devised a simple brass restrictor that tamed the worst of it. So the official verdict was double-edged. On paper, the Hurricane was outclassed in speed and climb. In the air, it turned tighter, it was forgiving, and it was honest. And the personal impressions that have come down to us went further than any official report could. The most famous of those impressions is attributed to Werner Mulders, the leading German ace of that period and one of the finest fighter pilots in the world. In an account passed down by the British historian Alfred Price, Mulders is quoted describing the captured British fighters. He found them very simple to fly compared with German machines, and childishly easy to take off and land. He called the Hurricane good-natured, said it turned well, but judged its overall performance clearly inferior to the Messerschmitt. With heavy controls and a sluggish response on the ailerons, the Spitfire he rated a class higher in handling, yet as a fighting aircraft he was dismissive of it. It is worth being honest about that quote. It is genuinely published, but it rests on a single source, and no original German document behind it has ever surfaced. Whether Mulders personally flew these trials is itself uncertain, since that summer he was commanding a fighter group in France. So treat the quote as what it is. A verdict attributed to a great pilot and repeated for decades, rather than a signed report. The truly solid evidence is the August document itself, and even that report, for all its German confidence, could not avoid writing down the thing it did not want to say. The despised British fighter could outturn the best aircraft Germany had. That is the surprise. Not that the Germans fell in love with the Hurricane. They did not rate it as a dogfighter, and they were partly right. It was slower. It struggled at high altitude. Its fabric and wood rear end could catch fire alarmingly. The men who flew it knew all of this better than any test pilot. The surprise is that the fighter the Luftwaffe measured and filed away as second best went on to shoot down more German aircraft than any other defender of British skies. And here is the deeper irony, the one that sits at the heart of this whole story. The Germans judged the Hurricane the way the world has judged it ever since, by the wrong scale. They asked how fast it was, how high it climbed, how it would fare one against one with their best fighter. By that measure it was unremarkable, but that was never the job. The job was to be available in large numbers, to be easy enough that a freshly trained pilot could fight in it and survive, to soak up damage and come back, and to break apart the bomber formations threatening the country below. By that measure, the only one that truly counted in the summer of 1940, the Hurricane was extraordinary. There is a temptation, when we look back at that battle, to want a single hero. a single beautiful aircraft with elliptical wings, lit by the evening sun. The Spitfire earned its fame, and nothing here takes it away. But fame and effectiveness are not the same thing. The aircraft that did the most work, took the most risks against the most dangerous targets, and inflicted the most losses was the one that did not look the part. If your grandfather or someone in your family flew or serviced or simply remembered these aircraft, I would be honoured to read about them in the comments. The squadron, the airfield, the story handed down at the kitchen table. Those memories are the real record, and they deserve to outlast all of us. Later in the war, the Germans would formalise this kind of work. A unit often called the Rosarius Circus, led by Theodore Rosarius, toured captured Allied aircraft around frontline German squadrons so their pilots could see for themselves what they were up against. A Rechlin test pilot named Hans Werner Lercher would fly well over 100 captured types and write about them with a craftsman's honesty. But all of that came later, with newer aircraft. The Hurricane belonged to the first reckoning in the summer of 1940, when Germany held a captured example in its hands and could not quite bring itself to say out loud what the data showed. So what was the verdict in the end? The Luftwaffe's own answer was contradictory, and the contradiction is the whole point. On their score sheets, the Hurricane was inferior, and they were not wrong about the speed and the climb. In their cockpits, it was a pleasure, and it could turn inside the finest fighter they owned, and in the air over Kent and London and the Channel, the aircraft they had written off was quietly running up the largest tally of any defender in the battle. The Germans tested the Hurricane to confirm that it did not matter. The test told them, quietly, that it did. They filed the report and flew on toward a battle they were already, slowly, beginning to lose. And the plane fighter with the fabric skin kept climbing to meet them, morning after morning, flown by young men who did not need the fastest aircraft in the world. They needed one that would be there in numbers, that would hold steady while they aimed, and that would carry them home to do it again the next day. That is what they had, and that, in the end, was enough. If this story gave you something to think about, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay for the next one. There are a great many of these aircraft, and a great many of the people who flew them, still waiting to be remembered properly.